environmental consultant. Uh, his work aims to inform and inspire a more ecologically sustainable and equitable and resilient relationship between humans and our planet. His research, writing, and consultant has taken him to more than 40 countries. If you go on his website, he has a very fascinating and illustrious resume. He's the author of another book as well, called The View from the Cascade Head, Lessons for the Biosphere from the Oregon Coast. So Bruce seems to be working his way down the coast and is covering the West Coast biospheres at this point. He has a very extensive blog called Ecologica, which has almost 150 entries, and these are not just small entries. These are really extensive pieces, which are fascinating. I took a look at it the other day, and it's a fascinating read. I'll put his website in the chat, so you'll have an opportunity to follow up if you choose. So at this point, I'd like to turn the meeting over to you, Bruce.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Let me see if I can share my screen and start that way. Are you seeing my PowerPoint as it should be?
Yes.
Okay. Um, yeah, well, thank you very much for that introduction and for the invitation. I'm speaking with you from Falls Church, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., where I've lived for about the last 30 years or so, um, as I've been an international environmental consultant. But so we have a 3 hour time difference, and it's almost getting to be past my bedtime here. And if I say anything that seems quite silly, I just think I'll have an excuse, make that as my excuse for the whatever I might say that doesn't make sense. Um, you can, of course, call me on that later in the question answer period. So, yeah, Nature on the Edge is the title of this book about the two biosphere reserves on the California coast. And I really want to focus on the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve tonight because, of course, Marin County is part of that. Um, and here, of course, is the Golden Gate, the Presidio Heights with their serpentine cliffs. And what I want to do really is uh, go through several of the stories that relate especially to California native plant conservation because of the organization that you are. And first, though, I want to sort of give a little preface and background to let you know how I came to work on this topic and write a book about your biosphere reserve. I'll do a little bit of history of UNESCO biosphere reserves and in particular the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve. One of the things that's fascinated me is how people really, really make a difference in the history of conservation. And the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve has some really amazing heroes and heroines of conservation. So I want to sketch a little bit of that history. And manzanitas and serpentine is a fascinating relationship that I want to touch on briefly. Um, let's see, ecology of bishop pine and in relation to fire, especially at Point Reyes, is something I want to touch on briefly. Restoring Lobos Creek dune vegetation in the Sunset District of San Francisco is another topic. And finally, Mission Blue butterfly recovery on San Bruno Mountain with its lupines is something I want to touch on as well. So I don't know how long this may take. If it gets too long, I'll stop and shift and make sure we have time for you all to ask questions that might be of interest to you. As Dave said, I've had a chance to work in 40 countries around the world over about the last 30 years as an ecological consultant. I started out, though, with getting a PhD in ecology and evolution at the University of Colorado, and then was essentially an academic researcher and teacher there for about a dozen years before I bailed out to Washington, D.C. and international work um, to be more applied, interdisciplinary, and um, working with clients here. One of my main clients is the U.S. Agency for International Development. I've worked with the World Bank, with World Wildlife Fund, with the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and so on. But I've always been trying to understand the human-nature relationship and how to make it more sustainable. And UNESCO Biosphere Reserves are a really interesting type of protected area, you might say, or type of laboratory for trying to understand and improve the human-nature relationship. According to UNESCO, these are places for studying and improving the human-nature relationship to do several things: conserve biodiversity, increase human well-being, and then increase social and ecological sustainability and resilience for the future as well. So every time I've had a chance in my travels around the world, I've tried to get my clients like USAID to send me to biosphere reserves in countries where I'm working, where I'm doing an analysis for them, for example, because I see those as models that they could potentially follow. And in that regard, I've managed to get to 35 biosphere reserves in 17 different countries, but there are now 748 of these in 134 countries. This is from the World Network of Biosphere Reserves website. And there are quite a few new ones every year being created or established. There are at present 28 of them in the United States. So Golden Gate is one. And after working in these 35 UNESCO reserves around the world, I thought that it would be interesting to focus in, do a deeper dive in places that I really love. My PhD research was carried out on the Pacific coast, the ecology and behavior and genetics of an intertidal snail. So I traveled up and down our Pacific coast and love it. And so I thought, well, I should look at the three UNESCO biosphere reserves in the US that are on the Pacific coast. And the first one I looked at was Cascade Head on the Central Oregon coast, starting in 2018. And then Golden Gate and Channel Islands in California. The first book that I did was from Cascade Head, which was published in 2020. And now Nature on the Edge, Lessons for the Biosphere from the California Coast, just came out last fall. Maybe some of you recognize the picture on the cover are the outer cliffs of Tamales Point north of the Pierce Ranch. So this is a chunk of the Pacific Plate sliding, west of the San Andreas Fault towards the northwest. And this nature on the edge sort of felt right from that, partly because this got kicked off from a writing residency that I was accepted for in 2021 at a place called the Mesa Refuge. And Mesa Refuge is a a writer's center in Point Reyes Station, pretty much perched. Well, it's at the toe of Tamales Bay, of course, so it's pretty much sitting right over the San Andreas Fault, right on the edge of the North American plate. And they have used that as a metaphor. Their little logo down in the corner, maybe you can read, it says Mesa Refuge, a place for writing at the edge. And they also talk about they want to facilitate writing of ideas at the edge, sort of cutting edge ideas about things like humans and nature. So I want to, acknowledge them and thank them for that writing residency because that kicked off. In a way, that was the launching pad for this book, Nature on the Edge, starting in early 2021. Now, diving into the history a bit, the word, well, actually, the concept of the biosphere was first discussed in a book by a Ukrainian geochemist in the 1920s. And then by 1968, UNESCO picked up this word biosphere during a time of a lot of concern about global environmental problems. And they held a conference that they called the Biosphere Conference. And that was the first time that that word was used in international deliberations or consultations. And that conference led to what is called the Man in the Biosphere Program. Of course, at that time, of course, man is humans and the Biosphere Program. And it led to a world network of biosphere reserves. On the right-hand side here of the slide is the cover of the report of that conference, which is actually quite an interesting historical document. But I wanted to point out to you folks, because of your interest in native plant conservation, that bioregion-based site selection was a fundamental principle for these UNESCO Biosphere Reserves from the beginning of its conceptualization. This is a map showing essentially global ecoregions, more recent map. But if you look at the ecoregions on this map, and then look at where the scatter of these biosphere reserves is, basically what they've tried to do is stick a biosphere reserve, at least one, in pretty much every biotic region, floristic region, ecoregion of the planet, if possible, because in each of those, there would be different human adaptations and economic possibilities. So as models, that's why they wanted that biotically based planning. A guy who was really behind this is an American plant geographer, vegetation ecologist named Stanley Kane, who actually did his research in the Great Smoky Mountains. So the background slide I have there is of the Great Smokies. But he first taught at the University of Michigan and eventually wound up at UC Santa Cruz. From 1965 to 1968, he was the assistant secretary of the Interior, and he was, basically sent to deal with UNESCO and as they were holding the Biosphere Conference. So he was actually a key participant in the Biosphere Conference and planning it. And in that report that I showed you, he has a chapter, or his talk is reflected in that report. Here's a guy that I hope some of you know about, but he's a San Francisco native. He grew up birding in Golden Gate Park, Ray Dassman, and he at first he got his PhD under Starker Leopold at UC Berkeley, studying wildlife ecology. And then he went to Humboldt State and taught there for a long time. And then he decided he wanted to do international conservation. So he first came to Washington, D.C., and then went to Europe to advise UNESCO and the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, starting in about the mid 1960s. And he was really an architect of the UNESCO Man in the Biosphere Program. He ended up in his last decade or more teaching at UC Santa Cruz and was instrumental in supporting or pushing for the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve. And Desmond, when he was in Europe, this is the title of a big report he did, a system for defining and classifying natural regions for purposes of conservation. It's a progress report to the IUCN in 1973. And I've just chopped out the North American bioregional map that he created. And I'll blow this up in a second so that you can see how those three biosphere reserves I've just talked about on the Pacific coast fall within these biotic regions. Then a person who was instrumental in choosing the first 29 biosphere reserves in the US is Jerry Franklin. So he's a forest ecologist from Oregon State and then US Forest Service and finally the University of Washington. And he went to NSF in Washington and in about 1974 led a committee to choose the first 29 biosphere reserves in the US. This is a paper from Science magazine, Science, the journal, by Jerry Franklin, describing that program after it had been established. The first 29 biosphere reserves in the US were created in 1976. This is a 1977 paper explaining to the scientific world why. And so again, he's showing a map of essentially biotic regions or ecoregions of the country. And this is on the left, a blow up of Ray Desmond's map. And then arrows that show you these biosphere reserves that I looked at. So what Desmond called the Oregonian biotic province is where Cascade Head is. Then what is the California Floristic or Biotic Province is where the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve is. And then the Channel Islands or the California Islands are another biotic region, partly because of the incredible endemism that happened there in what have been called California's Galapagos. Okay, so now a little bit of the history of Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve. This was established in 1988, so it was a latecomer, 12 years after the first US biosphere, 29 biosphere reserves. And it kind of came about from a push, especially from a woman named Lori Wayburn, who is a San Francisco native, now directs the Pacific Forest Trust, but she's the daughter of a San Francisco conservation power couple named Ed and Peggy Wayburn. And she went to work for first UNEP in Nairobi and then UNESCO Man in the Biosphere Program in Paris in the late 70s and early 80s and came back to California, her home place, saying, hey, we need a biosphere reserve here. And there had already been a push by plant ecologists, especially from Stanford. Hal Mooney in particular, and Peter Raven was there then, to an extent, Paul Ehrlich. But they were also saying, like, the California Floristic Province is so amazing, it doesn't have a biosphere reserve, it needs one. But the Golden Gate area is so huge that I think people were afraid to tackle it. It was just like, whoa. Anyway, Lori Wayburn managed to push this through with a lot of help from the Golden Gate National Recreation Area and from NOAA fisheries and the marine sanctuaries off the coast of the Golden Gate, Fair, Gulf of the Farallones and Cordell Bank. But this is huge. It's about the biggest, it is the biggest in the US, 1,656 square miles of land and 26,000 square miles of ocean in those marine sanctuaries that go clear out to the 200-mile limit, the exclusive economic zone. Within the Bay Area, within the what they call the zone of cooperation and partnership are 2 million people living. And in the Bay Area, there are 8 million people. And there are right now about 20 something main partner organizations that range from Mount Tamalpais State Park to Point Reyes National Seashore to the San Francisco Water Board to Jasper Ridge Biological Reserve. So it's very complex, very huge, and really, really a good learning place. So I don't know how many of you before this knew that you lived in a biosphere reserve, but when I was doing the background research for this, I really found that most people that I talked to in the Bay Area had never heard of the Golden Gate Biosphere Reserve. So it's a missed opportunity, I would say. It's something that you all should learn about and promote. Now, one of the things I promised to talk about too was heroes and heroines. And one of my truly favorite ones is Alice Eastwood. I'm sure as plant people you've heard of her, but she, amazing woman. And this is a beautiful picture of her, unnamed photographer, but at the time when she was the director of the herbarium at the California Academy of Sciences, which she was for decades, from 1894 to 1949. She published 310 scientific papers, described 395 species, 2 whole genera are named after her, and 17 species are named after Alice Eastwood. And let's see. Yeah, manzanitas were one of her specialties. She loved manzanitas, and I love manzanitas too. She published a revision of the taxonomy of this whole genus Arctostaphylos in 1934 when she was 75. And she had some hunches about manzanita taxonomy, which is extremely complicated, very, very tricky, even today with genomics. Here is Alice poking around with her plant press. I suspect that is at the Laurel Hill, on Laurel Hill in the Bay Area before even the cemetery was taken down. But that was a botanizing place where she found a bunch of manzanitas and other plants. Here is Alice. She, when the 1906 earthquake happened, she had some heroic moves to save type specimens from the California Academy of Sciences from fires and collapse of buildings and so on. But she then went tagging along with the famous California geologist C.K. Gilbert soon after to go up to Marin County to basically the Olima Valley to document what had happened in the earthquake. So there are these pictures of her in her, old early 1900s dresses standing in these cracks near Olima and Bolinas and so forth. Turns out that after C.K. Gilbert's wife died, Eastwood and Gilbert were romantic partners for a decade or so before he died, but then she lived to be 90 something. So, and an interesting story as far as I'm concerned. Um, Alice Eastwood in 1904 gave a talk to a women's garden club meeting in San Francisco. And she supposedly she's quoted as saying, if I had $1 million, I would buy the Redwood Valley and part of Mount Tamalpais, and I would donate it as a public park. Of course, she didn't have $1 million, but I think somebody who probably was at that garden club meeting was the wife of William Kent, Elizabeth Kent, who they did have millions of dollars. And they ended up buying Muir Woods, Redwood Valley, Redwood Creek, and helping establish Mount Tamalpais State Park too, but in a very sophisticated, tricky, quick move. Kent gave Muir Woods to the U.S. on the condition that Teddy Roosevelt would designate it through the Antiquities Act as a national monument and name it after John Muir. So it's really partly because of Alice that Muir Woods exists, because of the Kent couple, and then John Muir. So Mount Tam, of course, really interesting fire history here. If you're not familiar with that, I write some about that in one of the essays in this book. This is Arctostaphylos montana, the Mount Tamalpais manzanita, growing on serpentine. This was described by Alice Eastwood. And this is an artwork that is the frontispiece for my book, done by Oakland-based artist Robin Chandler, who may be sitting in on this talk by Zoom, I'm not sure. But she sort of took some of the images like those two that you've seen, and then imagined condors coming back and made this sketch that became the frontispiece for the book. So very thankful for that artwork. You may know that, well, a bunch of botanic gardens, but especially the Tilden Regional Botanic Garden over above Berkeley, has a collection of California manzanitas. There's something like 108 taxa of Arctostaphylos, evolutionarily significant units, both species and subspecies. And something like 90% of them, 90, no more than that, 99%, 98 or 99% are found only in the California Floristic Province. So anyway, the Tilden Botanic Garden has a big collection of, I don't know, maybe a few dozen species. And the Franciscan manzanita, this was collected at Laurel Heights Cemetery in San Francisco. So that's, sort of San Francisco's native manzanita. Here it is at Tilden. The San Bruno Mountain manzanita, I'll talk about San Bruno Mountain in a bit, but this is a rare and endangered Arctostaphylos, again described by Alice Eastwood. Here is it, a picture of it. And this is an interesting one, the so-called Presidio manzanita or Raven's manzanita, first spotted by Peter Raven from Stanford at that point, who then went on to the Missouri Botanic Garden. But this turns out to be a subspecies of the Mount Tamalpais manzanita, even though it grows on the San Francisco Peninsula. And Alice Eastwood had somehow sussed this out. And later, taxonomists said, no, she's wrong. And then modern genomics showed that she was right, This is a subspecies of the Mount Tamalpais manzanita. But what they've done with collections of Ravens manzanita, there's only one, as far as I know, old plant of ravens somewhere here on the Presidio Bluffs. But they've taken cuttings and cloned them and outplanted them. And this is a picture. You can see some blue flags. This is a big sort of matted clone, a few meters in diameter, outplanted in 1987. That's now doing pretty well on these Presidio Bluffs. Anyway, there's a strong relationship of manzanitas to serpentine. This is a cool place if you haven't been there, near Springs on Mount Tamalpais, which is called Serpentine Power Point by the folks who do the Mount Tamalpais circumambulation, which is this ritual walk that Gary Snyder and Allen Ginsberg and Philip Whalen started back in the late 60s. Anyway, here's a giant chunk, big outcropping of serpentine. So manzanitas, a lot of their endemism is related to serpentine. This is Sargent cypress, which is also a serpentine specialist endemic on Mount Tamalpais. Here again is the Mount Tamalpais manzanita. Okay, anyway, and because serpentine soils have, suppressed plant growth, they're often very dry, and so they have a special relationship with fire. So plants that adapt to serpentine soils also have special relationships with fire, and manzanitas certainly do. Arctostaphylos certainly does, with a couple of really interesting adaptational pathways, which I could go into in questions, but you could also read about that in this book. So let me dive into another fire ecology topic here, which I promised was bishop pine on the Point Reyes Peninsula. Bishop pine are one of the three so-called California closed cone pines. The other two are knobcone and Monterey pine. So they all have serotinous closed cones, that is, cones that stay closed usually or often until they're heated by fire and the seeds are released. This is essentially old growth bishop pine on the north slope of, or northwest slope of Mount Vision on Point Reyes Peninsula, kind of near the road that goes over to Chimney Rock and the Point Reyes Light. So this is old growth, quote unquote, stuff. It's probably 250-year-old unburned bishop pine. And some of these big trees, a couple feet in diameter, have really corky bark. You can see that reminds me a bit of ponderosa pine or Douglas fir, very fire resistant lower bark. So that big trees could resist fire. Here's a tree that I found that had fallen across the road, so they cut it, but it grew up to this point and has a fire scar. And the tree survived the fire and then grew for this many more years, putting out a healing curl, of wood around the fire scar. So this was a bishop pine that survived. You can see kind of how thick the bark is here. So it was able to resist a low intensity fire. But the real secret for bishop pine are these serotinous cones. So these are cones that sort of waxy scales keep them glued shut until they get heated up by a fire, and then giant release of seeds. And so they basically then reseed themselves and take over the habitat that they are in. This is a the Vision Fire happened in 1995. It was a human started fire, but here's an intensity map, fire intensity map of the Vision Fire. And you can see it's not uniform. Everything didn't burn totally. But in the places where it burned totally, what you get are these now, what is this? Almost 30 years later, dog hair, so-called stands of really, really dense bishop pines that just launched from, like essentially a turf of seeds, little trees. And now they're all falling down and crashing down. And in another 150 years, they'll look like that old growth forest that I showed you, with just a few survivors widely spaced and so on until the next fire comes along. And another plant that lives in that habitat and likes fire too, actually needs fire, is a manzanita. I think also named by Alice Eastwood, the Marin manzanita, or Bolinus manzanita, which is, I think, Arctostaphylos imbricata. Okay, so fire, ecology, manzanitas, pines, serotiny. Let's jump to San Francisco Peninsula itself. A buddy of John Muir's was William Keith, another Scotsman, who was sort of almost like the Western version of a Hudson Valley painter in the late 1800s. This is a painting of his from the Sunset District of San Francisco called Sand Dunes and Fog. And of course, the sand dunes were seen as worthless until people wanted to build houses there. And then that's how you get Sunset and Richmond districts of San Francisco out to the west, total houses. But there's a place there, Lobos Creek, where the Golden Gate National Recreation Area has started restoring or has restored a bit of native dune vegetation along Lobos Creek. And it's really small patch, but very, very fascinating to see. One of the species that's so famous there, and I'm not a botanist really, so I may mispronounce this, but the San Francisco Lysingea is, very rare endemic plant found on these dunes. And this is it blooming there at Lobos Creek. Not uncommon, really. And then this is called deerweed, which was the host plant for the larvae of the Xerxes blue butterfly, which lived there and then became extinct in the probably mid 1940s. And the extinction of the Xerxes blue led some people then to found a society for invertebrate conservation called the Xerxes Society, which is still going strong. There are a whole bunch of Xerxes blue butterfly specimens in the California Academy of Sciences, so they can actually do genetics on them now and look at their genomics and see what they're related to, which of their butterflies are their closest relatives. And the one that they found that was closest genetically and morphologically, it looks about like Xerxes, but not quite, is the sand dune silvery blue from some dunes down along Monterey Bay. And just recently, fairly recently, I think, it was actually after my book was published. So I was tracking the story as people were thinking about doing a reintroduction of this closely related relative of Xerxes to the Lobos Creek area. And then I think they've finally done that within the last perhaps a year. Maybe some of you know more than I do, but this is the sand dune silvery blue, and whether it's going to take hold and eat up this deerweed, we don't know. One more. Okay, now one more heroes, heroines, and the San Bruno Mountain story. These couple of women, Betty Higgins and Mimi Whitney, in the early 1970s, lived in, I think, South San Francisco or one of those cities along there. And the proposal was by developers, we're just going to chop the top off of San Bruno Mountain, take it out, dump it in the bay, and, fill it in, and then we'll build whatever we want to build out there. But who needs a mountain? And these women were like, no, we don't want that. And they started writing letters, letters to the editor in the San Francisco Chronicle. A little movement of protesters started up, and they actually then blocked this development on San Bruno Mountain. And then what happened was um, there's a butterfly there, the mission blue, uh, and it was listed under the Endangered Species Act. And in order to do some development stuff, the Endangered Species Act allowed the developers to create a habitat conservation plan that would protect habitat on San Bruno Mountain for the butterfly. So there's now a San Bruno Mountain Ecological Reserve. And this is a picture from San Bruno Mountain, a little bit telephotoed, but it's close, close, close to San Francisco. You can see the Oakland Bay Bridge crossing there. This is habitat for the mission blue. And I went out with a group from the Golden Gate National Recreation Area to translocate some mission blues from San Bruno Mountain to a place called Sweeney Ridge, also in the GGNRA, closer to San Francisco, where they had planted some of the lupines that are the host plants for the larvae of mission blue. This is the silvery lupin, which is the main host plant for the larvae. And it turns out there are a couple of other species of lupin that live there. And that the fact that there's more than one species of lupin that the larvae can potentially use, apparently is what allows their populations to survive through years and seasons where the silvery lupin doesn't do so well, but maybe another lupin down in a valley provides habitat to help the population make it through that year. Anyway, we caught not very many because the Fish and Wildlife Service seriously restricts how many you can catch in an endangered population like this, but a few mission blues, females and males, and took them over to Sweeney Ridge. This is with a group of Park Service folks, turning them loose on Sweeney Ridge. It was really windy, so they put essentially netting over the lupins that they had planted there. And here's a female's mission blue getting used to her new habitat, and theoretically starting to lay eggs there and rebuild another population on Sweeney Ridge, where they used to exist, but where they went extinct in the 1980s, I believe. Okay. Time-wise, I don't know where we are, but here's essentially my last slide, unless we have time, and I'll defer to Dave or whoever. I have a few more slides, like about a half a dozen of some plants from the Channel Islands that you may be interested in.
We have time, Bruce.
You have time?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is a picture of Mount Diablo, the highest peak on Santa Cruz Island, which is anyway, maybe Maine, you'd say Channel Island, northern Channel Island. There's also Anacapa, Santa Rosa, and San Miguel. But you can see some of the vegetation, several species of manzanitas. This is the Santa Cruz Island manzanita in the foreground. And one interesting relationship here on the right is the island live oak. It's endemic to Santa Cruz and San Miguel Islands. And then on the left is the island scrub jay, which is a unique species now found only on Santa Cruz Island. But the jay and the oaks have a really amazing synergistic relationship. The jays harvest acorns and cache them. So they're a main food source for the jays. But in caching them, they disperse the acorns and essentially propagate the oaks. And this whole system of synergy got totally disrupted when for a century or more, because in the 1800s, the Spanish came and introduced pigs, sheep, horses, cattle, and the pigs especially liked the acorns and completely disrupted the whole ecology. So now they've gotten rid of the invasive or whatever, introduced feral species, pigs and so on. That was a big controversy that I write about in my book. The Nature Conservancy having them shot by hunters from New Zealand didn't go over well with the Humane Society, but they did it. And anyway, no pigs. And so this relationship between oaks and jays is coming back. And they're finding that as the oaks get replanted on the mountaintops, it's changing the whole hydrology of the island back to what maybe it was like before, before it got disrupted by all this intervention. Interesting that there's a population of bishop pine on Santa Cruz Island. Very different looking ecological situation than on on the on Point Reyes. Much drier, smaller trees, etc. But you can still see the serotinous cones. And an interesting study that I found was that some of the island scrub jays have shifted to become pine cone specialists. So they're able to pry open these serotinous cones and eat the seeds. And they've actually started to evolve different beak shapes, almost in the way that Darwin's finches have. And finally, here's a picture of the Santa Cruz Island bush mallow, which was thought to be extinct on Santa Cruz Island, except that someone finally found it at a place called Christie Ranch on the western end of the island, growing beside an outhouse that had been fenced, and the fence happened to keep the sheep and cattle and things from coming in and eating it. So they found this plant, and then they've done a whole restoration project. So this plant is coming back, the Santa Cruz Island bushmallow. Anyway, all this stuff is just material pulled from this book. I think of this book as essentially a biography, sort of the life story of these two biosphere reserves, from ecological, evolutionary, social, political, historical, and philosophical points of view. One of the things that I've tried to do for both the Golden Gate area, the Bay Area, and also for Channel Islands is to look at the indigenous cultures and how they were adapted to these places, and also look at their worldviews, their philosophies, and how they saw themselves fitting into these places. And both in the Bay Area, of course, the Miwok the Ohlone, and so on. Palmo cultures, totally fascinating, totally amazing. And in the Channel Islands area, the Chumash, and there's a lot of work done on the Chumash. That may be a place where the first people from Asia came to North America by boat, not across the Bering land bridge. There are human remains that have been discovered on the northern Channel Islands, San Miguel, I think, more than 13,000 years old. So, and I try to touch on that indigenous stuff in here too. The book is, I guess you'd say, creative nonfiction essays, but it also is really deeply researched and has lots of endnotes to track down sources for people who are interested in the research behind it, as well as a really strong index. So you can go ferreting in or digging in and find, everything I have to say about Alice Eastwood, for example. Anyway, thanks for your time. And then if we have time for questions, Dave, I'm going to let you facilitate all of that, but be happy to talk to you. And if you want to get in touch with me, here's some contact info.
We do have time for questions, Bruce, and I want to thank you for both your ecological insights and the reminder of the advocates and scientists whose we are deeply indebted to for the work that they did that provide us with the kind of open space that have researched in your book, reminding us that there will be a future generation that hopefully will look back upon us and say that we carried on their legacy.
Yeah, here, here. That's, I think, one of the messages is people make a difference. I mean, they were the things we see that they've done that worked and that lasted and their struggles and their efforts are inspiring to us now, I think. So I think that's a big message.
So if great, thank you for not stopping the screen share. If anybody wants to ask Bruce a question, please raise your hand and feel free to unmute. Well, I don't see any additional questions. What I would like to do at this point is for any local Marin chapter members who did not get a chance to vote at the beginning of the meeting, I'd like to open up the poll and let's see if this is the right one.
I have a question afterward. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, while I'm fussing with the poll, Hill, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
I'm sorry. Anyway, that was a great talk, and I love Arctocephalus, so I particularly love that part. I have a question. It's not a plant question. It's so the Secretary of the Interior, he was Secretary of the Interior for 3 years. The person you've mentioned, I forgot his name, who was involved in biosphere, do you know who I'm talking about? You mentioned
Stanley
him.
Kane, yeah, Stanley Kane.
Yeah. So this is just an odd question, but why just 3 years? Why was he only in that position 3 years? Did you look much into that? It's sort of an odd time, like it was either a late appointee or change of administration.
Yeah, no, I actually didn't probe into that. That was during the Ford administration, as far as I remember. And I got put onto him by an amazing guy, Tom Gilbert, who has been involved with biosphere stuff for a long, long time, who also grew up in the Great Smokies. So somehow he knew Stanley Kane. But Kane, I think because of his global plant geography interest, somehow was able to go over to work with UNESCO and with IUCN and really convince them that these biosphere reserves should be situated in, and representative of and laboratories within the plant within the biotic communities, the ecoregions of the earth.
I just had another short question. When you were mentioning the Channel Islands, you didn't mention San Nicolas, and I think that's used as a target island for the military. Is that just completely devastated as far as plant communities?
You know, that I don't know. The Channel Islands Biosphere Reserve includes only the four northern Channel Islands, which are the bigger part of the Channel Islands National Park. So, for example, San Clemente, the one you mentioned, Santa Catalina, those are not part of the Biosphere Reserve. And yeah, one of those is still owned by the military, that one that you mentioned, I think.
I could say a tiny bit. I actually know a person who is doing plant restoration on San Nicolas.
Oh,
Right this second, I can't think of his name, but I took the kind of a Zoom class during a plants class during the pandemic with him. So,
Carolyn Longstreth, I think you're the next with the hand up. You need to unmute, Carolyn.
Okay. Bruce, yeah, thank you for this really interesting talk. And yeah, the book sounds great. You made a comment toward the end about how the Native American cultures in the Bay Area were somehow, adapted or deeply connected with the biological resources here. I'd love to hear a little more about that. And maybe you could just focus on one of the groups and give us a little more idea how that was.
yeah. So I have one whole essay in this book called Coyote's Basket, where I try to look at the Native American cultures and issues of the Pomo, Miwaka, and Ohlone. But when anthropologists first came and started looking at these California groups, they said like something's really different than the East Coast. You know, here in
Mm-hmm.
California, we have all these small groups, which they called tribelets. You know, they were so small. And then when they started looking at where they lived and how they were adapted, they seemed to find that it was they had essentially micro bioregional economies set up to, harvest shellfish and whatever on the southeast shore of San Francisco Bay, or a valley up coming off of Mount Tamalpais or whatever. But there were something like 60 California tribelets. You know, it was greater diversity of languages and cultural groups than Western anthropologists from the East had ever seen. They were astonished. And some of them wrote about this kind of like, yeah, the eco-regional adaptations. And off the top of my head, I can't quote you the names of the scientists who did that, but again, the book is referenced and you can go dig out that information if you're interested and read the background research that tries to document this more carefully.
Paul De Silva, you can unmute.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce.
Yes, thank you, Bruce, for such a wonderful presentation and for having put all of this information together. I just have a question, maybe takes the opposite direction from Carolyn's question, and that is looking toward the future. Does the designation of the Biosphere Reserve give us any more leverage or, I guess, hope for the future sustainability of the region, given all of the different players who are involved?
Okay, well, that's the $1 million question, I guess. I guess what I would say is that we have a tremendous task of transformation to do if we're going to get to a sustainable human ecology on this planet. And one of my essays toward the end kind of links up with the old idea of ecotopia, which is a Californian idea you may know about, or with bioregionalism, which Ray Dasman was one of the sort of founding thinkers of bioregionalism, along with Peter Berg and along with Gary Snyder. Those guys thought that we needed to shrink down and develop sustainable bioregional political and economic systems. So my vision, I guess you would say, is that biosphere reserves, including Golden Gate, but it's pretty complicated, should be the place, the nucleus, the seed source for the ideas of growing a new sustainable human economy in that place. Oof, you have a lot of people. I don't know. I mean, Ecotopia, that old book, was the one that I sort of started thinking about because I read it back when I was in college and, centered in California, really. But I think we need to think about how do we get to ecotopia from here, and do biosphere reserves, does this whole concept help us get there? And how can we also use some of the worldviews from either non-Western sources or indigenous sources to inspire us, instead of the, humans in charge of everything and we'll figure it out? A bit more of an ecological humility, I think we need in our worldview. And so anyway, the $1 million question, but there is a Golden Gate Biosphere Network, and they have a website. They're doing active stuff with all their partners. I don't know if the California Native Plant Society is actually an engaged partner at this point, but One Tam, Mount Tamalpais State Park, all those folks are. And so you should start looking into it. And if you think it could help, get involved.
Thank you. Robert Finkel, I think you're next.
Thank you. Thank you Bruce, thank you for a very stimulating talk. I think toward the end of your talk, you mentioned something about evidence on some of the Channel Islands for very early settlement by humans coming in from wherever they came in. And I wonder if you could amplify that statement a little bit, how far back that pushes the settlement, and any evidence about where these people might have come from.
Yeah, there's a gang of paleoanthropologists and ecological anthropologists who've been working on the Northern Channel Islands. John Erlandson is one of the main ones who's been working on that. But yeah, some archaeologists found human remains that were dated to about 13,800 years old, which is before Folsom, which was thought to be one of the earliest lithic technologies, and the people who came across the land bridge and so on. So these guys have claimed that North America may have been populated through what they call the kelp highway instead of the land bridge, by people coming down in boats and ending up on the Northern Channel Islands maybe more than 13,800 years ago. There were still pygmy mammoths there on the Channel Islands then. And so there's a lot of good stuff. If you dig for it, you can start digging, Google for it. But John Erlandson, Erlandson, is one of the main researchers on that.
Thank you very much. I'll follow that up.
Okay, and I think next, Yvonne McHugh.
Yeah.
With a question.
Yes, I wanted to ask whether I know you're aware of the ranches up at Point Reyes National Seashore that are I guess I read in the next year and a half, they're going to, a 10 or the 10 of 12 are going to be, what would you call it? Abandoned or whatever. Was that, is this part of, is this discussed in your book as far as what plans?
Sort of. This was kind of secretly, perhaps, no, it wasn't really even in the works when I was there. I have an essay in this book that is called Seance at Sky Camp. And I don't know if any of you have been to Sky Camp, but it's up on Inverness Ridge, camping site in the Point Reyes National Seashore. And I used to camp there with friends when I was in college. But what I imagined in this essay was a seance to bring John Muir and Aldo Leopold together and sit around the campfire with them and talk about Point Reyes and the vision for the place. Partly in relation to the elk, which is partly in relation to these ranches, of course, but also in relation to humans and nature at Point Reyes. And I do talk quite a bit about there's a good some fairly good documentation of the human history on the Point Reyes Peninsula, both fire history and also Drake, I think it was Drake's chaplain or somebody was documenting how the Indians were hunting elk up on the barren ridges there at Point Reyes, like at Sky Camp. And it was sort of an elk hunter-gatherer economy. I didn't really try to burrow into the controversy with the cattle ranches, but have my own opinions. And I certainly, in that essay, probably tipped my hand to saying that I thought it was a good idea to take down the elk fence that penned the elk onto Tamales Point, which is the decision that the Park Service has taken. And once you take down that elk fence, those elk are going to go everywhere and compete with cattle. And I think that was all part of the decision by the ranchers to settle because they knew that economically, it just wasn't going to work. So anyway, it's a complicated situation. I touch on it, but all these decisions, even about the fence, I was just sort of hinting toward because the Park Service folks at that point were just barely feeling squeamish.
Thank you, Bruce. Jeffrey Perron.
Since we're talking about bioregions and visions, I wanted to relate a conversation that I had earlier today with someone who raised the question of what's happening in LA now, where there's massive destruction and entire communities are basically being wiped out. But it also seems like a potential opportunity for various groups to come together and plan how to rebuild this area in a way that is ecologically sound in terms of the energy systems, the plants, the water systems, how water is used or recycled. So I just wanted to put that out to people. It seemed like a fascinating idea to contemplate, and maybe there's even a way to build up some kind of steam behind it.
Yeah, and in your more local area too, one of my essays, which I probably will get some flack for at some point too, is called Making Friends with Fire. And I looked at both the Vision fire and also the more recent Woodward fire on Point Reyes, which burned really close to, well, both the Vision fire did too, but both those fires have burned close to houses and, inhabited areas. Nothing like the density of course, in the LA area. But still, just the idea of how can we make friends with fire-prone ecosystems? And Californian ecosystems are fire-prone no matter pretty much where. But certainly the chaparral type ecosystems in in a Mediterranean climate like that are perfectly fire prone and fire adapted. How are people supposed to live there? That's what we need to figure out. Or should we be living there? It's one thing. Maybe we shouldn't quite be living there. Maybe there's some indigenous models that was like, no, 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 guys, we're not putting our village up there because that's going to burn up 2 years from now. So, I mean, maybe there's some indigenous wisdom that we could learn from too about that.
You mind? You still have your hand up?
I'm so sorry. I'll take it down.
Oh,
Yeah.
no, no problem. Bruce, thank you again for that really stimulating talk, and thank you also for being willing to stay up late to talk to us folks on the West Coast who are 3 hours earlier than you are.
Okay, well, not so bad for me. So, yeah, but again, if you thought you heard me say something stupid, just blame it on the fact that
No.
that's my bedtime.
Okay, I'd like to launch the poll for the board election. And again, it's for people who didn't have a chance to vote at the December meeting and who are Marin chapter members. So let me just launch that. And if you didn't vote, also not for people who voted earlier in this meeting, people who have never voted before, if there are any left in the meeting, so that we give everybody a chance to vote. Okay, well, I think. All right. A note about the next month's meeting, which will be on the second Monday, which is the 13th of February. Craig Dremen has spent a number of years restoring native grasslands and developing a very unique technique which does not involve weeding or seeding. And he has some really quite amazing before and after pictures from a 14-acre site which he spent a number of years on in Kite Hill down on the peninsula. And he is going to tell us about his strategies. And I think you will find it very interesting because native grasslands are some of the hardest restorations to do. And under certain conditions, Craig has shown that it's possible. So we look forward to seeing you at the February meeting. And again, thank you for coming tonight, and we hope to see you next month. So thanks again.